Welcome to the Library of Virginia. I'm Catherine Fitzgerald Wyatt. I'm the Education and Outreach Manager here at the library, and we are delighted to have you for today's book talk. And thank you. This actually is really great. The Belgian Friendship Building, originally constructed for the 1939 World's Fair, and one of only a few surviving buildings from the celebrated exhibition, somehow, and I want to know why, I'm hoping we'll find out today, ended up on the campus of a historically black university in Richmond. Authors Dr. Kathleen James-Chakraborty and Bryan Clark Green will give presentations on their research, followed by a Q&A with our larger panel. And I hope you had a chance to look at some of the items on display from Union out in the lobby when you came in. If not, definitely check them out on your way out. There's some really interesting things in the cases. Now I would like to ask Dr. Raymond Hilton to come to the stage to introduce our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you, and greetings to all. I'm honored to be here to set the stage, so to speak, for the fascinating story of the Belgian Friendship Building. But going back, on April the 3rd, 1865, the Union Army marched into Richmond, and the American Baptist Home Mission Society could now undertake its long-deferred quest of sending teachers and missionaries to establish an educational institution for the now free African-American population. Though there were challenges to overcome from the very beginning, their efforts eventually brought forth Virginia Union University. It took several different changes of campus, the most famous of which was that at the former Lumpkin slave jail just down the road on what was then 15th and Franklin Street. It also took a merger in 1899 with Wayland Seminary and College of Washington, D.C., and a second merger in 1932 with the neighboring Women's College, Hartshorne Memorial College. But by 1939, Virginia Union University had developed into an academic powerhouse and a community leader. The original campus buildings, known affectionately on the Virginia Union campus as the 9 Noble Buildings, were constructed out of Virginia granite and Georgia pine and had been designed by the world-famous architect John Hopper Coxhead, who had hired students to help in the construction. As the 1930s were drawing to a close, the university had added 2 new dormitories, Huntley and Hartshorne Memorial Halls, and sported an impressive sports field named after our second president, Dr. George Rice Hovey. Prominent VUU alumni included Robert Lee Vann, the lawyer activist who published the Pittsburgh Courier, and who will play a significant role in the events which will be discussed presently. Also, there were luminaries like Albert L. Kroll, who invented the ice cream scoop, famed educators like Benjamin Ways, president of Morehouse College and one of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s mentors, and VUU president Dr. John Malcolm Ellison, another key player in the story which will unfold. There was artist, wood sculptor Leslie Garland Bowling, the famed economist Dr. Abram Harris, Henry Vinton Plummer, captain with the Buffalo Soldiers and the first black chaplain in the U.S. Army, and Harlem Renaissance hostess, influencer, and pioneering journalist Bessie Banks Bearden, and many others. But increased student enrollment necessitated additional infrastructure. The need for a library, gymnasium, and science classrooms and laboratory was a particular concern. And now we have set the stage and the story can proceed after I introduce the speakers. Kathleen James-Chakraborty is professor of art history at University College Dublin. She has written widely on modern German architecture, including the Bauhaus, and about global and feminist approaches to the history of agriculture. Katherine Kuenzli is a professor and chair of the Department of Art and Art History at Wesleyan University. Her publications on modernist art and design span French Impressionism and Belgian Art Nouveau to German Expressionism and the Bauhaus. Bryan Clark Green is visiting associate professor in the architectural school at Virginia Tech, and through research and practice, he investigates how buildings are modified over time and how that modification impacts our understanding of architectural history. Arthur Art Clement has worn numerous hats during his 50-plus years in architectural construction project management and architectural history by honoring the built environment of communities he has served. Art has collaborated with the National Trust for Historic Preservations on their HBCU Cultural Stewardship Initiative, and with the Getty Foundation concerning serving Black Modernism program honoring the mid-century modernist buildings of African American architects. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Hello. In February 1939, a representative of the Belgian government rushed from the French luxury liner the Normandy, which had just docked in New York City, to the Empire State Building. He was the first representative of a foreign government to submit its designs for a pavilion to the World's Fair that opened the following year in New York. No one could have anticipated that the building, intended in part to celebrate what the Belgians saw as their supposedly civilizing mission in the Congo, would end up on the campus of a historically Black university here in Richmond. Nor could they have envisioned that the tower that was once one of the pavilion's most distinctive features, and which originally housed Carillon bells, now at Stanford University, would come to serve as a memorial to Robert L. Vann, about whom you've just heard, in a city more famous for its much smaller monuments to the President and leading generals of the Confederacy. The Belgian Friendship Building is a superb example of interwar European modernism. Entirely unornamented, with huge expanses of plate glass enabled by an underlining steel skeleton, its design was in keeping with major new civic buildings in Europe. And it's interesting here that Virginia Union outpaced white institutions in the North, such as the Illinois Institute of Technology, it's buildings by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe I show at bottom, or the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the upper right, in acquiring such a building. One designed by Victor Bourgeois, Leon Steinen, and Henry van de Velde, three of 20th century Belgium's leading architects. How, moreover, did a building designed in part to celebrate Belgium's largest colony, as still marked here on its base in Richmond, those, the sculptures that are now on the base of the Vann Memorial Tower, provide the facilities Dr. Hinson described, in which a generation of civil rights leaders were educated and which Martin Luther King Jr. spoke 5 times, not to mention all those Panthers basketball games. Although the worst abuses of the Congo Free State, the private property of King Leopold II, had largely been stamped out after Belgium took control of the territory in 1908, the regime was still rightly notorious, especially among African Americans, for its continued exploitation of the local population. The most noteworthy figure in our story is certainly John Malchus Ellison, the first African American and the first VUU alumnus to serve as president of the university, a role he undertook in 1941. Indeed, the transition from white to black leadership was engineered in part by the Rockefeller family-funded General Education Board, because they realized that Ellison, although he was ambivalent about the project originally, was the person who had the leadership skills to make it happen. They were right. He raised much of the money and presided over the building's gradual reconstruction in Richmond. Led by an honorary chair, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, the campaign was a national effort to which a racially and religiously diverse public contributed. Equally importantly, he guided the university through World War I, World War II, when many of its faculty and students left to enlist. Also, equally notably, he proved an able leader in peacetime, overseeing its post-war increase in the student population, facilitated by greater prosperity and the GI Bill. Key to the building's transformation as well was into a symbol of African American achievement was Jessie Vann, the editor of the Pittsburgh Courier, then one of the country's two most prominent African American weeklies. In 1941, she pledged to raise $25,000 in order to have the tower named for her late husband and predecessor at the Courier's helm. During the war, under Jessie Vann's leadership, the paper would launch the Double V campaign, calling for victory against Jim Crow as well as the Axis powers. Naming the tower for Vann, which made it, as the Courier proudly pointed out, probably the country's largest memorial to an African American, attracted a who's who of support, including Mary McLeod Bethune, the Los Angeles architect Paul Revere Williams, and Adam Clayton Powell Sr., the former pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem and an alumnus of Wayland Cemetery. But let us turn the clock back. How did all this happen? The pavilion occupied a prominent position at the fair, just opposite that of Paris. You see it at the very top center of the postcard. The country had attracted enormous sympathy in World War I when the Germans invaded it at the start, and Americans led by Herbert Hoover had donated much of the food that kept the population from starving during the war and contributed as well to its post-war reconstruction. The pavilion, a steel frame clad in schist from the Ardennes and handmade Courtrai tiles, was one of the fair's most widely admired buildings, in part because these materials gave it a more permanent appearance than the white stucco structures that predominated. And here you see the skylit Great Hall, which housed tapestries, and also on exhibit were examples of both Belgian artisanship and industry. While all three architects contributed to the final design of the building, Bourgeois was responsible for the cinema, which showed documentaries on Belgian art and culture. Steinen, who had initiated the design process, was responsible for the two pieces you see here, the Congolese section and the restaurant. At many fairs, the Congo had its own building, but here it was a part of the larger Belgian structure. The fair opened in the spring of 1939. Its success was so great that a second season was proposed, and Belgium was the first country to sign on. In May 1940, the mood of optimistic celebration was turned on its head when the Germans once again invaded Belgium. And you see here the Belgian civil servants listening to that news in the fair, being looked out over by a portrait of King Leopold III, which was quickly removed because Leopold had collaborated with the Germans. This turn of event left Jan Albert Goris, the Belgian civil servant, left in charge in a bind. He had no money to pay for the building's disassembly, to support the Belgian construction workers who had stayed in New York to do this, or to pay the customs duty if the entirely Belgian materials out of which the building had been constructed remained in the United States. He astutely realized that the answer was to repackage the building as a so-called gift to an educational institution in the United States. And exactly how Sidney Henning, the treasurer of Virginia Union and a native of Richmond, learned of this remains something of a mystery, but certainly the union's then president, William John Clark, signed on quickly. The General Education Board, a Rockefeller-founded philanthropy, having already pledged to support the erection of a new library at Virginia U, and probably at Virginia Union, and probably anxious to help the Belgians, came on board with the funds that got the ball rolling. The arrival of the Belgian pavilion rechristened the Belgian Friendship Building in Richmond, and the campaign to raise the funds to put the structure back together was one of the city's leading news stories in 1941 and widely reported nationally. The process was protracted above all because of the United States' entry into World War II that December. Charles Russell, the local African-American architect who had worked for Maggie Walker, including on the development of Frederick Douglass Court, was originally in charge. His firing after long years of service to Virginia Union was undoubtedly prompted by his awareness that the Belgians had padded costs in order to support construction workers left stranded in the U.S. Moreover, Hugo van Kuyk, The Belgian architect in charge of adapting the design of the original pavilion for use in Richmond was slow to complete the necessary plans, in part because he wasn't licensed to practice in the U.S., and in part because he was probably busy with intelligence work. He later did many of the maps for the Normandy invasion. If the war was responsible for delays, it also provided opportunities. The partially completed building served as an induction center for both black and white troops on different days of the week, with the income from the rental to the United States military, as well as a canteen Virginia Union ran, critical to the post-war completion of the conversion into an academic facility. The structure was finally dedicated in 1949, with the science labs completed the following year. It provided Union with an updated plant and a distinguished supplement to the Noble Nine, who you see in the postcard as well. Still one of the most architecturally impressive ensembles on any Southern campus. The new facilities were key to the liberal arts education the university, already celebrated, as you heard from Professor Hinson, provided. And its alumni who studied in this building include the Richmond 34, responsible for prompting the desegregation of the city's lunch counters, and a who's who of politicians. Many of you will know the names of Douglas Wilder, Henry Marsh, and Rosalind Brooke, not to mention the basketball players who played in here, Charles Oakley and Ben Wallace among them. Union has an exemplary record of training its graduates for service, including as pastors and educators, but also as politicians. The Belgian Friendship Building remains a landmark in Richmond. What we see, however, on the Union campus today is not exactly the same building that was dedicated there in 1949. Neither the Belgian construction workers who helped reassemble their World's Fair pavilion in Richmond, nor the architects who guided that task took account of the shift from a temporary to a permanent structure, and they failed to add the layer of waterproofing that Van de Velde himself called for when he used the same structural system in Belgium. As a result, water ingress has been a continuing problem, and many of you know the stories of the last few storms. Bryan will speak more about that. So the band of glass blocks that ran down the length of the tower disappeared in the 1970s in an early recladding. The Belgian Friendship Building nonetheless continues to stand as a proud symbol of Belgian aesthetic achievement and African American educational attainment here in Richmond, a city with few other examples of outstanding examples of mid-century modern architecture. In her weekly column, Eleanor Roosevelt described it as a gesture of international and interracial goodwill. It remains that today. And before handing over to Bryan Clark Green, whose research and conservation work on the building formed the nucleus of our book project, I would like to warmly thank him, Catherine Kuenzli, and Art Clement for their contributions to what was very much a group project. But in closing, I would like to particularly acknowledge the key role that Mrs. Celicia Gregory Allen played in the preparation of this book. She has long kept the archives of Virginia Union in meticulous order, and her many helpful interventions and patient support were crucial to our research. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here this afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity. And one person I want to thank in advance is David Gordon, head of facilities at Virginia Union. We did a number of projects over the years on the Belgian building, including stabilizing the tower, working on the science building, doing master plan. We did the Getty Grant master plan. And David was there through all of it. And sometimes I don't know how he keeps these buildings together. Where I'd like to begin with is a very simple premise. The Belgian building was not designed to last. That fact, which may seem like an historical footnote, turns out to be the central preservation problem, and is what I would like to focus on here. The original 100,000 square foot pavilion was reduced to 41,104 square feet, reconfigured as a library, science classrooms, an auditorium which became a gymnasium, a tower, and a covered gallery. The building that arrived in Richmond was already a reduced version of itself, stripped of elements that could not be afforded, adapted to a program its original architects had never imagined. The building contains two distinct technologies. The first is an adaptation of conventional steel construction, modified for rapid assembly and disassembly. The second is a novel envelope enclosure system. The first has performed exceedingly well. The second has not, and is the source of most of the issues facing the building today. The structural system is a steel frame with two main components. First are the built-up girders, which you see on the left. I-beams and lattice sections riveted together as single units. A photograph taken in Richmond during reconstruction shows them on the ground awaiting reconstruction, still intact from their Atlantic crossing. The second component is the roof system. The roof structure, which consists of 3 variations of a Pratt truss: longitudinal trusses connecting the full length of the building, latitudinal trusses connecting across the short axis, and heavier trusses at the long spans. And the drawing I show you here is from upstairs, and this is where the original drawings do survive. And it's an amazing, I'm going to put in a pitch for the architectural drawing collection here. For those who fund it more. It's one of the great repositories of architectural drawings in the Commonwealth, and the more feed and care it gets, the better. What is notable is the logic of the connections. Each subassembly, the columns, the girders, the trusses, are held together with rivets and were never meant to come apart. But the subassemblies are connected to one another with bolts. Standard construction of the period would have been riveted throughout. The use of bolts at the connections between major units and minor units made rapid assembly and disassembly possible and tells us something precise about the designer's intentions. The building was conceived as a large reusable kit of parts, and the fasteners record that intention. The Science Building offers a representative cross-section of the structural system. Its geometry is defined by 8 built-up columns in a plan 3 bays long by 1 bay wide, each bay 52 feet 6 inches square. The columns are composed of doubled Belgian metric steel I sections, IPN 34S, and their stamps are visible today. And this is one of the major conundrums with the building, of course. Everything is metric. Nothing is English except for the things that were added in Richmond, which makes it, our mantra is always use original materials. Holy cow, just getting them here is a crisis. So every window that breaks, every door that jams is a major problem to repair. The roof trusses vary in weight in direct response to structural demands. The intermediate trusses carry only gravity loads, while the column line trusses also resist lateral forces. Because the components were designed for multiple transatlantic voyages, minimizing weight was almost certainly an explicit parameter. And I show you here an animation of the assembly. As we start with footers, we see our built-up steel columns. Now we see our Pratt trusses at the column lines. This is our lateral system. Now we see a variant of the Pratt truss along the perimeter. These are girders, also a variant on the Pratt. We have intermediate false trusses, another iteration of the Pratt. These are for stability, and lateral cross bracing, which is diagonal. Then we have the roof and ceiling purlins that carry the roof structure. And this is what the gymnasium looked like under construction. And you see all of those elements here before the enclosure system has been brought to bear. Now, this system has performed remarkably well. In all of our years working on the building, we've not detected any movement of the structural system. The frame has remained dry with no significant corrosion. If anything, the members are somewhat overscaled for the building in its current configuration. Remember, it was a larger, taller building in many ways. The structural frame is not the problem. The elevations are clad in architectural terracotta tiles, each 24 by 15 inches wide and 3/4 of an inch deep. Steel purlins run horizontally around the perimeter of the building, functioning as tracks onto which the tiles were placed. And you see here, the tiles were then wired back. It's sort of a galvanized wire clip that went back through holes in the steel, or sometimes looped all the way around the steel members. They're not consistent with how they're wiring, and you can see with the circles on the right, you can see some of those wires hanging. And then they were mortared into place. And this is sort of an animation showing you how the wall section came together. Here are your purlins in place, and then into the purlins are tracked these terracotta tiles, and they're mortared only after they're in place. And the wall assembly just then continues ad nauseum. Now, one of the interesting things about the way the wall enclosure system comes together is that the mortar itself is not performing a structural role. The weight of the tile is being carried on the steel. The mortar secures them in place, but basically keeps the water out and keeps the steel dry. That's its job, and it's been very bad at that job. The underlying problem is the mortar. The mortar was entirely too stiff for the application. And so the mortar is too stiff, and its coefficient of thermal expansion does not match that of either the steel or the terracotta. Differential movement between these materials has cracked and displaced mortar in many locations. Now, the loss of mortar does not, in and of itself, mean that the tiles will fall. They'll stay in place generally, because they are wired and held in by gravity. But failed mortar leaves the steel purlin system exposed to water, and water against steel is the building's most persistent threat. And you can kind of see that horizontal cracking, because what happens is the tiles are expanding, the steel doesn't move, and they fracture in horizontal lines. And that's been so if you look at the building, you'll see multiple horizontal fractures. It doesn't necessarily mean the tiles are coming out. They're secure in their spot, but that's evidence of them moving at inappropriate differential rates. Now, the wall assembly compounds this problem. In some locations, a concrete block wall, which is a feature only of its life in Richmond, this was not present in New York, provides a clean interior surface. But there's an uninsulated air gap between them and there's no water barrier in this gap. In other locations, particularly on the upper portions of the wall, there is no inner wall at all, and you look directly at the backside of the terracotta. The building was designed as an exhibition hall. Very little thought was given to thermal performance. Everything we now understand about building science was simply outside the scope of what the architects were asked to solve. I mean, the method would have been bring in a mechanical system, apply brute force, and overcome the inefficiency of the envelope. That was its strategy as a building at the fair. Whoops, did I shoot ahead? All right. The Belgian building received no major renovations or repairs until the first decade of this century. By 1966, the university decided to demolish the building, a decision reversed not so much by a preservation argument, but by the absence of resources to act upon it. So you know it's bad news when you see a plan and there are dotted lines over your building. It's never a good sign. In 1986, the university president noted that the building required complete renovation. The funds were not available, and the building has survived largely because no one could afford to act in either direction. Standard preservation practice assumes unit construction. To address damage, we replace the compromised unit with one that matches the original. The logic is coherent on its own terms. The Belgian building's cladding does not work that way. It's a suspended assembly of terracotta tile, galvanized tie wire, metal purlins, and Belgian metric steel struts that function as an integrated whole. When a tile fails, the repair logic of unit replacement collides with the reality that the unit never existed independently of the system, and the system was never designed to be maintained. Proper repairing of a single broken tile requires an individual mold and a custom fired piece at costs that are steep and with expertise that's exceedingly rare. It's worth naming a distinction between buildings that resist preservation intervention because of formal discipline and buildings that resist it because of designed impermanence. At Mies van der Rohe's Dirksen Federal Courthouse, no element can be changed without disturbing the relationships between units, assemblies, and systems. The curtain wall is a legible expression of the building's organizational logic. To change a unit is to disturb the relationship, and the relationship is the architecture. The building that resists intervention because it was designed, our building resists intervention because it was designed with absolute precision for impermanence. The Belgian building presents a related problem with a different cause. Its assembly logic is equally real and internally consistent, but it was not designed to last. It was not designed to be repaired. It was not designed to be maintained. What the Belgian building asks of us then is something that preservation practice does not have a ready template for. The structural frame will likely outlast anyone in this room. The envelope is failing by the logic of its own making in ways that conventional repair cannot easily address, and that modern building science cannot retrofit without cost to the thing that's being saved. The building's intelligence and its fragility are the same thing, a system conceived for efficiency, lightness, and for the crossing of an ocean and the assembly of an exhibition, now asked to perform indefinitely in a climate that it was never designed to meet. Caring for it means accepting that some of its problems cannot be solved, but only managed, and that managing them well over time may be the most honest form of preservation available to us. Thank you very much.
I'd like to ask Art Clement, who wrote the foreword, what he can say about the state of preserving mid-century modernism at HBCUs and what encouraging words he can give us about examples and programs of things that are moving forward, because he's such an expert on that. Some optimism, perhaps, at least in other cases.
Thank you, Kathleen. I had a chance when I flew in this morning from Atlanta, which is where I'm based, to go by and look at the building. And it was my first time seeing it up close. And it's indicative of a lot of historic buildings that have, these intractable problems that Bryan has referred to. But the buildings I've worked on at Atlanta University, Clark Atlanta, Spelman, Morehouse, Tuskegee, other schools, is that the school institution really has to determine what is significant about the building and what is it that they're trying to maintain. And here with the Belgian Friendship Tower, it's a very complex story. And so I think that they can't be true to everything about the history. They're going to have to look forward and decide what it is that they can really carry forward. And the building had a purpose and this great history in the 1939 World's Fair, but it just can't be maintained. And so how are they going to go forward? And for these institutions which are under resourced, then it's a prioritization of how to bring to bear what needs to be done. I might point out in the 1930s, when most of these Negro schools back in those times were trying to get accredited. And in Virginia Union's case, they needed a library. That was true of Atlanta University and for Spelman and Morehouse. And in that particular application, they came together and agreed to have a shared library, which has continued to the current day. And so they have a building that was built in the 1930s, and they've had to maintain it and upgrade it. And one of the things they have done since then is that they built another library, but they have converted that facility into an art museum. And so you've got a structure here with, you said 40,000 square feet? It looks much bigger than that, Bryan. But it's a gymnasium. But what can it really become? And what can they mobilize support for and go forward? Virginia Union as an institution has a rich history, wants to continue. But this is a very prominent location on campus. And so I would like to talk to them, and I've mentioned to Bryan, there's another program that the National Trust for Historic Preservation has now in trying to help HBCUs which have these historic buildings. And given the history of this building, it has a process for going through and helping the school reassess, what can we do with that? And there's some hard choices that will have to be made. And I think it's important that the school not feel that the entire history, the pavilion World Fair part of it, is interesting from an architectural historian, but for the ongoing preservation of the school, it may not, it needs to be readapted and re-envisioned. It would be my recommendation. And it has happened on other schools. Tuskegee's got the same thing, a very historic campus, a lot of older buildings, but they have to be reinterpreted.
And I'd also like to ask Katherine Kuenzli, who another one of the co-authors, what this building means in terms of Belgian design of the period and what it means for the Belgians.
Yes, thank you. So my role in the book was to reconstruct the Belgian side of the story, which was not always good news. And a lot of my role was to uncover what was essentially a myth about the building, which I'm hoping can be useful in making the kind of decisions that Art is referring to about what part of its history is worth preserving and what parts need to be discarded so that the school can move forward. So in terms of what's worth preserving, right, I mean, it first comes to mind the tower. The tower, which is a 165-foot bell tower, it is obviously missing its bells. And I was able to show why. I mean, there was a certain, I think we need to be honest about the certain amount of deception that happened in a moment of crisis that Belgium was experiencing that explains some of the puzzles that Bryan has spent the last decades unpacking, its impermanence, right? How can you have a bell tower without bells? Nevertheless, the building's significance is really that it represents a version of modern architecture without ornamentation, and that kind of creates a kind of dialogue between past and present. Modern steel construction that I'm happy to hear has aged well, with hand-molded terracotta tiles with clay from a specific region of Belgium. That combination is really unique, constructed on a civic scale, with a courtyard that, you know, gives the building a bigger footprint than it actually has in terms of interior spaces. So I would say the civic scale, the structure, the combination of industrial and hand-molded materials are really lovely, significant, and I would actually refer, in terms of thinking through a plan, to the example of the former technical school designed by the same architect, Henry van der Velde. And one should also mention the engineer, Paul Sellies, who was really responsible for devising that steel plan, which is also in place. The third building that needs to be mentioned is the Ghent University Library, which has just undergone a tremendous restoration, and we just spoke there in February. So 2 buildings in Belgium I can point to by the same architect have undergone a significant reconstruction and re-envisioning. One is the technical school at Leuven. It's now called Twee Bronnen. Was built as a technical high school and is now a public library. It has the same terracotta hand-molded tiles with a very similar frame, although I believe that frame is more, has more brick infill and is using more concrete and less steel because they could use heavier materials that weren't needing to cross the Atlantic Ocean. But that building was saved by the efforts of an architecture professor at Leuven, Luc Verpost, and is doing well and has a real is a point of civic pride in the town of Leuven, where its beautiful tiles have been repurposed and are moving ahead. And I would add that the Ghent Book Tower is a good parallel example of how this tower, I was just in Ghent, and it has a similar features, you know, if we can recover the schist with the glass bricks, allowing the illumination, which is a central design feature of that tower, which was striking at the World's Fair and attracted a lot of critical attention. Today, when you're walking through Ghent, you see that tower. You see it at the day, you see it at night. It has a kind of civic presence. And I would like to see the Belgian Buildings Tower with its named memorial for Robert Alvan to have a similar presence. Last night as I was coming in on I-95 from the airport, I was looking in the dark for the tower, and I'm pretty sure we passed it. And although I have this tower etched in my memory, I had a really hard time finding it at night. So it's kind of lost that stature that it had through the interplay of schist and glass that lent it a kind of soaring height with the steel frame, permanence with the schist, and dramatic flair at night with the interior lighting, which I think can be actually, something can be done to recover that. And I can tell you that the Belgians, we had a good attendance at our talk in Belgium, and the Belgians are very interested in this history and would be very good partners because they have recently restored really beautifully 2 buildings from the exact same era with some similar materials.
I'd like to open it up now to the floor also for people who have questions and comments. Many of you know the building much better than we do, than many of us. Yes.
Yeah, I had a question about the aspect of the colonialism and the iconography on the reliefs, and what kind of an effect, or how is that being considered in terms of is that problematic, especially considering the building's on an HBCU? and knowing, the effects of Belgium and their efforts in colonial Congo in the early part of the 20th century.
I think that's a decision for VUU. I would not want to see those bas-reliefs destroyed, but whether they're visible on the building or not, one of them is supposed to show what the Belgian Congo was like before the Belgians, and then one is supposed to show the so-called civilizing mission of the Belgians. I don't think there's much positive that can be said about the Belgians in the Congo. And it's very important to remember that during World War II, Congolese workers mined uranium that produced the uranium for the Manhattan Project under circumstances that have never been reconstructed, but I can promise you were not what you would want. And I also found it very interesting in doing my research in Richmond on the Belgian Friendship Building and on Ethel Bailey Furman. I spent a lot of time in this building reading the Richmond Afro-American, which unfortunately hasn't been digitized, but is all on microfilm here. And African Americans in Richmond followed developments in the Belgian Congo in the late 1950s and early 1960s very carefully and very critically. So they would have had awareness of that. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke in this building just before flying to Accra, Ghana, to watch Ghana become the first independent black-ruled country in sub-Saharan Africa. And he didn't comment specifically on the Congo in his remarks, but he certainly commented on colonialism. I can't recall the exact words, but they're in the book. So whether you just plant bushes, whether you move those somewhere else, Bryan probably has ideas about this. Many of you in this room have ideas about this. It's not for me to say, but I would say that there are many paradoxes in the idea that a building that was designed for this purpose was converted to such different purposes very quickly as a result of World War II. And for me, that pivot is the most interesting thing. And for me, the most important thing is the Vann Memorial Tower. When I read in the Pittsburgh Courier that that was probably the largest monument to an African American, that wasn't something many people could talk about in the 1940s comparison to Monument Avenue. But it matters. It was a response. That's why people like Mary McLeod Bethune were willing to work so hard for this building. And they didn't say up and down, this is our response to Monument Avenue. But it was. And I can remember in 2018 being in Richmond to look at Monument Avenue and seeing that building in the distance and being drawn across under the highway to go look at it and finding it as a moment of optimism in reaction to something that I did not find a moment of optimism. But Bryan, Bryan and Katherine, yeah.
Yeah.
There's an anecdotal story that followed Frank Lloyd Wright around at every university visit where the students would come up to us and say, Mr. Wright, this building is terrible. What do we do about it? And the story is Wright's response is always, well, plant ivy and pray for rain. But Union did something like that for many years. They planted a row of boxwoods in front of the longest and largest of these terracotta panels and took very good care of those boxwoods. So for many years, they were obscured by boxwoods. And so, I mean, there are ways to do things and there are ways to do things.
Yeah, so I would add, I guess, two perspectives. One is that as far as I could tell, in the sale of parts of the building, and its parts are really scattered around, there was that Virginia Union did not ask for those panels. They were not part of the negotiation. Their negotiation was for science facilities, a library, and an auditorium gymnasium. If I were asked to weigh in on the question of what is essential to the building as it was envisioned by the people who were building it in Virginia, under Ellison's leadership, I would say those panels were not among them. And that's an important fact to know. And secondly, I would say that there are panels by the same sculptor, Arthur Dupagne, in the Royal Africa Museum just outside of Brussels in Tervuren that has recently undergone a multi-year renovation and reinterpretation. And they have found ways, I personally, I feel that those reliefs would do well to be removed and put in a museum as part of the history of this, very complicated and not always very good moment, and that perhaps someone comes over from the museum in Brussels where they're dealing with the exact same historical questions about how do you represent, what do you get rid of, what do you present in different didactics.
And there was an alternate path that could have been followed. In the renovation plans for Richmond, there was designed in the original main hall drawings a second story, a partial second floor that contained a museum and an exhibition hall. Now, we don't know what was supposed to be in those, but they were large enough and long enough that these terracotta panels could have been there, and they would have been mounted the exact same way, just on the inside face of the steel, not the outside face. Now, that didn't come to be when the main hall was rushed into use as an induction center, which really financially saved the university during World War II. It's as many universities were in that same trouble. And when the Army money ran out and the induction facility left, it was put back into use as a gym and not an auditorium. And I think the vision just failed. But I will say it is framed. That floor is up there. The floor is framed. It just, the stairs were never built and it was never fleshed out. But sort of in the alternate universe, these could have been indoors in a place where they could have been interpreted under controlled circumstances.
The other thing I would add is that the Belgian at Work panels have nothing to do with the Congo, and they're there too. That was just propaganda for Belgian labor in the 1930s. So the pieces that couldn't be sold off elsewhere ended up here.
And just one more small point is that, Sogores, who was the deputy commissioner, remained in New York until about 1950, and he had continual contacts with VUU. It's in the archives. And at one point, he offered VUU a kind of photo exhibit of the Congo by André Cauvin, who was doing a lot of propaganda for the Belgian Congo in the US. And that was an offer that VUU politely refused. So I think their position was consistent, and that needs to be said.
Yeah, I don't mean to stir up anything or.
No,
No,
it's a great question.
In the
Interesting kind of paradox in terms of.
Absolutely. In the foreground, you, and then behind, secondly. Yes, go ahead.
I'm hearing two things at once. First of all, I wanted to know how Virginia Tech got involved with this project. But what I'm hearing is the building itself, well, it might be more than two, the building itself, the whole Belgium situation, as Belgium is and was. Then I'm hearing about how, and I know for sure, that HBCUs are underfunded. Then the last part of this is the cloud over blackness today. How does all of that come together, and how does Virginia Union rise above? I'm just going to leave it at that. I want to hear about all of that.
And at some level, I mean, as a white woman, I don't want to be the one who offers all of those answers. But I thought it was really important to get as much of this story out into the public as we could. And my hope is that this does something to raise the recognition, one of the building, but also of Virginia Union, because in researching this, the story of how much Virginia Union matters and how much it's achieved was something that growing up in Maryland, I knew about Morgan and Howard. I didn't know about Virginia Union. And it's an impressive story, and and the underfunding is chronic, and it's based on, let's be honest, completely on racial discrimination. UVA doesn't have the kind of funding problems Virginia Union has. And Virginia Union educated people that UVA and these other schools would not accept until the 1950s, and in most cases the 1960s. And that includes also women, because Hartshorn was a major place for women to train. And I can remember when women started being admitted to UVA. I mean, I was 9 or 10 at the time. So, and Hartshorn and then Virginia Union were educating women far in advance. of that particular, obviously other Virginia campuses were different. So I think our job was to get the story out there, and our job is to admit that discrimination are there. And the dependence on the Rockefellers, they funded HBCUs, they funded them relatively generously, but then you look at how much money they gave to the University of Chicago. It's not the same. It's not the same.
But you know, a hero of this story is Ellison.
Yeah.
It is Ellison who ran a national campaign that raised the money to build this building by 1949, and that provided facilities that enabled an expansion of the curriculum of Virginia Union to have science laboratories, to have more books for research, and to reorient the curriculum around questions of civil rights. He had a vision for the curriculum when he took office, which did not involve this building, to be very frank, but he found a way to build the building and realize his vision for the curriculum. And if this tower can be refurbished and the name of Robert L. Vann prominently made better known, I believe that that would be a really strong signal. I mean, I was just walking around this morning around the State House. You know, there are a number of monuments, a number of panels since the early 2000s that are really recognizing the role of African Americans in building Virginia and building the society that we have today. This would be an amazingly visible, prominent landmark.
We have time for one more question, and then the authors will be selling. Yeah, well, the authors will be selling the books. The books will be signed in the lobby.
I want to applaud Katherine and Kathleen and Bryan for doing this book because it really describes the complexity that HBCUs were undergoing in the early 40s. Change of leadership, Ellison, you know, becoming the first African-American president and alum of the school, and you know, the Belgian influence and its history. And I can't think of another HBCU that has this kind of story embedded in its history. And the building has been on campus now since '49. I mean, it's been here a long time, much longer than the World's Fair situation, which was less than 2 years, right? So it's anchored here. The tower has this long history. And so what I have seen successful at HBCUs is for them to really wrestle with this history. And this needs to be a priority for the new president, the current president, and how he marshals the university to think, what should we do with this legacy? What does it mean for us going forward? And what do we preserve? What is significant for us? You know, what does this really mean for Virginia Union and our legacy as an institution here in Richmond? Quite frankly, you know, if Belgium wants to be a part of this, and I think you spoke very eloquently about what it's done in Belgium, but hell, they need to come to Richmond and do something about this building. I mean, they left this burden here with Virginia Union. So I don't want to put all of that on Virginia Union and say, you know, they've come up short. But how can you convene? I mean, one of the things HBCUs have done historically is to bring disparate groups together and talk about how do we exist together in this country. And I was talking to someone about, you know, he was, I think the fellow who was related to Sydney, he was talking about how blacks and whites would meet on these institutions, these campuses, talk about race relations. I mean, those first interracial meetings occurred at HBCUs. So that legacy there has to really be mobilized and to have some real deep thought about what is the heritage of this building, how does it, you know, what does it mean to us now, and to what extent can we mobilize a national campaign? And I was involved with Spelman when they were trying to develop a new technology center. And they had to make the argument, you know, why do women need to be involved in STEM? And they had a successful answer for that, and they were able to raise money throughout the country, and which then came back and made the local supporters say, well, we need to step up and support this too. So I think Virginia Union needs to see this as in a bigger scale, and how can this really, sustain us going forward. It's not just a normal building project that needs to be renovated. I mean, this is a big, complex legacy. It was meaningful to the school in the 40s, and Kathleen has talked about its importance of the 60s, which was a very significant time. How do we capture that? You had a gym, the library, the science building, and so it's a multi-purpose building. And so I think Virginia Union has really got to wrestle with this, and yet get some patrons and supporters to be a part of that conversation.
I wanted to say, I think you did a very good job of this in your book. The behind-the-scenes political, friendship, diplomatic negotiations. And the one thing, the boring thing that I just wanted to bring up was, just to end on Andy's note and yours, about the sense of place and race and optimism as opposed to colonialism. I retired out of CSX, and I don't think enough is ever given to, once the building negotiations were inked, how the building physically got here. And sense of place and race played a huge optimistic role in that. And one of the things, the piece I'm missing is the bells, because that's what took so long, was the bells were part of the negotiation, then it wasn't. And we had to figure out, transportation-wise, it was 95, 96, or 98 rail cars, just to get into the boring logistics of it. From Queens, which would be Long Island Railroad, a Pennsylvania Railroad, I'm going to get wrong, so I'm not going to say, and then RFMP, which is now part of CSX. And this would not have happened with all the players that you've already mentioned, but the politics of it with Eleanor Roosevelt, and I don't want to step on toes, but railroads were not going to move this building if it wasn't for the Rockefellers and the black porters, Pullmans, and the average person that we all know, if we just look left and right. And Acca Yard, which is right here, that we pass every single day, that we didn't have any of those custom stamps or duties. But the people of Richmond, Virginia made that happen as well. And I don't think that should be discounted by the colleges, whether it's UVA or VUU. Those people made that project happen in the end, because in the 1940s, we didn't have major strikes like the Pullman strike of the last century. It was a very politically wrought environment with wage and employment before, and we forget that because of World War II. I don't think this project would have happened without all of those components coming together, many of which were optimistic. So when this woman right down in front of me said, I see two things at play, there's still optimism in that, and we need to lift that up as well so that future generations can move our tomorrows forward.
And I think this is a conversation we can probably continue in the lobby. We're ready to sign books. Oh, one more question? Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Good morning. My name is Diane Watkins Walker. And in 2003, my brother and I wanted to celebrate our aunt and uncle, John and Elizabeth Ellison. And so I was doing some research, of course, about the Belgian Friendship Building, and discovered that before the building left New York, its carillon was pulled out and given to Herbert Hoover for his alma mater. And of course, my brother one day called me and said, Diane, I found the bells. I said, yes, you did? Yes, they're at Stanford University. Well, I had been at Stanford. I heard the bells ring. I did not know my connection to them. And they ring them all the ding-dong day. And so one thought was, can you get the bell? People said, can you get the bells back? Of course not, because of all of the racial conflicting that was going on. And so we decided to launch a campaign to put a carillon in the tower. And of course did that in 2011, launched Bells for Peace in 2004, became a 501c3, and we were able to leverage the community to help us raise some funds for Bells for Peace. But knowing that my Uncle John also raised $500,000 in the 40s to pay for building the Belgian building on the campus, we wanted to celebrate his work. So, I want to thank the panel today for coming forward. So much information, so much I found out that you may not know. For example, did you know that Robert L. Vann had a Liberty ship that was named for him and was launched off of Maine, and Portland, Maine, and that the ship crashed during World War II off the coast of Belgium, and the Belgians took the men in, and there were about 19 of them that were saved. And so anyhow, it goes on and on. I can keep on talking. But I thank you so much for coming today and giving the information. And Robert L. Vann, so special. And we in the community have not used his name enough. Robert L. Vann Memorial Tower. We don't use it. I had walked through the community before 2003 asking people, where is Virginia Union? And nobody could tell me. I would go to shopping centers and on the street, do you know where Virginia Union is? They wouldn't tell me. So I knew that somebody had to market and promote the university in a better way. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I think with that, yes, we will be available for questions and comments in the lobby, where there's material about the building on display as well, for which we thank Virginia Union and probably very much you. So thank you so much.